Welcome to Not Suitable for Democracy. I'm your host, Nick, and today we're going to be covering two stories that are currently unfolding at the time of this recording on August 11th. Okay, so first off, President Trump is looking to federalize or take over Washington, D.C. What does that mean? How do we get here? And what does that mean for the rest of the country? So, first off, federalizing DC or taking over the jurisdiction. Now, Trump is specifically using a section of the Home Rule Act of 1973 to declare an emergency, and in this case, to combat crime in DC, so that he will then be able to use a federal authority to take over the Metropolitan Police Department in conjunction with the National Guard. Now, in doing so, his goal will be to fight crime, fight homelessness, right? So the whole idea of how we even got to this point was all through a series of events that have occurred pretty much over the last 6 weeks. First off, Zohran Mamdani won the Democratic primary for New York City mayor. Now, that sounds very out of left field, pun intended, but the point here is that President Trump commented on Zohran's historic victory, and he did mention back on July 8th, 2025, that he would take over both New York City and Washington, D.C. Now, in relation to Zohran, right, we know that Zohran is Democratic Socialist, progressive, Muslim, immigrant, and he is the Democratic nominee. So because of that, right, Trump is looking to punch down, especially for, one of America's most progressive, liberal cities, also, with a huge, diverse population. So Trump wanted to make a point that saying, no, we are not going to let the Democratic Socialist, progressive Muslim immigrant govern that city. We are going to take over it. He's also using the same idea or concept for Washington, D.C. So how do we get here? Again, back in June when Zohran won the Democratic primary in New York City. Then July 8th, Trump issued this statement. And then over the past several weeks, the White House behind the scenes has been really trying to navigate how can they bring this concept to life? How can they make it happen? All they needed was their opening. So on August 4th, one of the former Doge employees, where this comes into play, why are we talking about a former Doge employee? Well, apparently he was beat up by a bunch of teenagers, right? So apparently this was during a carjacking. So whether the teenagers knew who this Doge employee was, or if they, just wanted to get him because it was wrong time, wrong place. But Trump being, he sees the opportunity. With that said, he knew that he could say that this former Doge employee, right, someone who worked for Musk, someone who worked for the White House, right, he was part of the conservative movement. He's one of the team, one of the guys. So with that said, he wanted to make a thing of this, right? So he went on Truth Social, but also, through press conferences, he was talking about how this is the perfect opportunity to show that crime is up in D.C. People should be scared. The fact that, that this could happen to one of us, it shouldn't happen to anyone. Trump is really trying to make that stretch in terms of how dangerous Washington, D.C. is, all because of this former Doge staffer getting beat up. Now, the kicker here is that when you look at the actual statistics for Washington, D.C., violent crime, stabbings, murder, those are down by 25% from this time last year in 2024. So crime is going down. That's great. On top of that, all crime, like robbery, burglary, all that other stuff, right? All crime is down 8%. So I wish it was higher, right? But the fact that it's down nearly 10% is definitely progress. So the fact that the trends are showing a downward shift in crime, right, closer to pre-pandemic levels, this is diametrically opposed to Trump's narrative of how crime is getting worse. But see, Trump is all about, playing for the political theater. He knows that when we see these incidents of crime on our phones, right, we know that people react more, have a stronger reaction to it, right? The fact that we can even, it gets spread very quickly with the virality of social media. It doesn't necessarily lend to the actual reality of what's happening, but it really plays into our perception. And Trump knows that. So the fact that now Trump is making the case that if we have, New York City Mayor Zohran Mamdani, Democratic nominee for mayor, and then we have Washington, D.C., crime is going up, he needs to come in and put his foot down and basically take over New York City and Washington, D.C. That's the message he's trying to send. So at least with Washington, D.C., we know that there is power that the president does have based on the Home Rule Act of 1973. Now, before the Home Rule Act, Washington, D.C. was basically governed by 3 presidential appointed commissioners. These 3 commissioners really just made the rules of how D.C. would work and run, and it didn't give representation to the people. So the Home Rule Act gave some self-governing powers to Washington, D.C., giving them a city council, giving them mayor, but also some power was limited. For example, Congress did, or still does, have the power to overturn or veto legislation from Washington, D.C. City Council. It also has a say in their budget. So while Washington, D.C. is the nation's capital and it does sit on federal land, the city doesn't have full autonomy. But the Home Rule Act in this particular case does allow for the federal government, if an emergency is declared, to have that control from 48 hours to up to 30 days. So that's basically a month, right? Trump is going to be looking to use that power for 30 days unless Congress creates a resolution to shorten that time frame. But we all know right now, Mike Johnson is the Speaker of the House with the Republican GOP majority. We know that they're going to do what Trump wants. So there was no chance that they're going to create any legislation to cut that time down against Trump. So with that said, we've got former Doge staffer who was attacked on August 4th. So now the National Guard was then deployed from August 5th through 8th. We know that Trump has declared federalizing D.C. At the time of this filming, August 11th. But more so, it's to instill fear. It's the impression that Trump is the strong guy, the strong man, and the fact that he can use the federal authority and the power of government to really keep people in their place. And it's all about control and power. So, where we stand today, we know that the mayor of DC, Muriel Bowser, she is currently going to be working with the Trump administration, where she held a press conference today. And while she wasn't really there to resist or push back, she really just gave a really, serious speech, kind of talking to the transitional phase that DC will be going through. Now, knowing that DC is, has a huge black population and it is a very liberal city, I see her doing this to really keep things smooth sailing, not because she doesn't want to fight and push back against Trump's agenda, but more so because I would suspect that if she rocks the boat, Trump is going to push back even harder. Because to be fair, right, the city council and the mayor only has so much power in comparison to the federal government, right? The fact that they couldn't even really create laws to really combat this if they wanted to, knowing that the GOP-controlled Congress could then veto or overturn Washington, D.C.'s legislation. So she knows she doesn't have the upper hand. So she's doing the best she can to obviously navigate, Democratic pushback and resistance while also trying to usher in whatever havoc is going to wreak on DC. Ugh. So anyway, she's going to be doing the best she can to protect and serve DC. And we know Trump is going to, we don't know how reckless he'll be, right? But we don't want this to be a model for the nation. Because what I suspect, and what many critics are also see coming from this move, is to then, where Trump could then point to saying, if there's crime in this area of the country, specifically in liberal blue cities, Oakland, Chicago, New York City, like Los Angeles, Trump has called these out at former press conferences, so he knows what he's going to be trying to do already. He's setting the groundwork to then go after liberal blue cities, ones that will not be voting in his favor. So in retaliation, he's looking to control them, instill fear, but more importantly, really exercise or even maybe even abuse his executive power, and we'll see how that manifests. Because ideally, he would love to militarize, these cities and put the police under his control, right? We already know from immigration happening that some cities are not necessarily coordinating with immigration enforcement with ICE. So the fact that we have blue cities that are resisting and Trump is not pleased how ICE is not able to coordinate with local authorities in certain jurisdictions, he's looking to, usurp that power and bring it back into the federal hands. So then again, he could be the strong guy, the bully, and really, but he really wants to really stick it to the blue cities, which isn't good because yes, it's one thing to take control of their police force or even get the military involved. But who do you think he's really going after, right? I mean, he's saying he's going after crime and he wants to fight the homeless population. He wants to, clean up the cities. But that's not exactly what he's going to be doing, right? Because, right, if they have a GOP-controlled House and Senate and he's the president, they could easily be passing legislation that would, provide housing for the homeless, get them off the streets. We could easily be having, stronger gun reform measures, right, to really combat crime, specifically gun-related crime. We know they could do that. Granted, we know that gun reform is a Democratic issue, so the GOP will never be touching that, right? But my point is, it's going to be people like you and me, people that don't look like Trump or don't support Trump, right? Protesters, people who have a different point of view, people who are not going to be just bowing down to Trump, people fighting back and resisting. These are the folks that Trump will be looking to use the military to fight against. Because now that he's president again, he knows his bounds of executive power, and he is looking to push it as far as he can to show who is boss. That's the man who we've known to become since he first came down that escalator, 10 years ago. And the fact we're still talking about him all these years later as he, continues his quest for dominance and for power. These are the moves he's going to be making. So the fact that we now need to be thinking what we say, what we do, and how critical of the president we really can be. He's already been, throwing, journalists out of the White House press room. We already know that he's looking to what he's done with the Paramount deal and Stephen Colbert, right? We know that he is looking to really push back against his enemies and get revenge because he's that vindictive because, again, it's all about him and his quest for power. Now, unfortunately, there's not that much we could do when it comes to the everyday person in the military. But what we can do is educate each other. Know your rights. Know when to speak up. Know when to look for help. Know when to look out for each other. But even more importantly, right? When we start sharing our stories and we can start waking people up as to what is really going on in this country, we will be better prepared to fight back, create community that's safe, build community, right? So it's until we can show that Trump is abusing his power and wake more people up, then we'll be in a good spot to really say, this is our country. Moving to the next topic of conversation, will the Supreme Court overturn same-sex marriage? Now, I'm married, so I take this very seriously. Now, what has currently been released as of today is that Kim Davis, you may have heard of her back from 2015 when she denied a same-sex couple, their marriage certificate when she was the Rowan County clerk in the state of Kentucky. As the county clerk, she's the one who was issuing the marriage certificates. And same-sex couple, they came in, they wanted a marriage certificate just like everyone else, and they had the right to do so, but she refused. She was citing her First Amendment right, thinking that, well, because she has a certain religious belief, which is totally crap, she was then thinking that she would be protected and she wouldn't have to issue them the license because it would go against her moral point of view. However, she was an employee of the state, and the First Amendment does not protect state rights like that, or state employees like that. So what wound up happening is that, the same-sex couple wound up suing, right? Emotional distress, the fact that she even denied them several times. Like, it wasn't just a one-time thing. And it wasn't just them. It was actually several couples who she denied. So why am I talking about Kim Davis now in 2025, 10 years later? So at the time of this filming, Kim Davis had filed a petition that would formally ask the Supreme Court to overturn same-sex marriage. Now, she filed a petition in conjunction with an appeal to the earlier ruling where the same-sex couple had sued her and they won, and she owes a ton of money, I think it's millions of dollars. So good for them. But point being is now that she's looking to countersue, right, file the appeal, and in conjunction file the petition that would overturn same-sex marriage. Now, in her reasoning, she had cited that she believes that the 14th Amendment, that sounds familiar these days, right? That while the 14th Amendment protects due process for same-sex couples, and we also have the Equality Clause that our Constitution protects, those two together are what granted same-sex marriage in this country so that we could be afforded the same rights as everyone else. Now, we've heard Trump talking about undermining the 14th Amendment. Now we have Kim Davis using the 14th Amendment to undermine same-sex marriage. You see where I'm going with this. The conservative movement is not your friend. They're just not your friend. And I hate to say it, but it's one thing to support family values, but if you don't want a gay marriage, then don't get one. It's very simple. In a country that likes to support the freedom of choice and freedom of self-expression, there is no reason why these people should rain on my parade, right? By the way, it's raining men. So that's the only parade that I'm worried about, okay? So with that said, we cannot have Kim Davis, filing the petition to overturn same-sex marriage, which would impact over 800,000 same-sex couples, okay? So 591,000 other same-sex couples got married after same-sex marriage became law of the land in 2015. So with all that said, where do we go from here? First, Kim Davis filed. So now the Supreme Court will actually have to make a decision if they're going to hear the case. Now, rumors are saying Brett Kavanaugh, Amy Coney Barrett, whatever her name is, and Neil Gorsuch are not interested in hearing the case. They're like, this is a done deal. We don't really want to hurt the court's credibility, so we're like, maybe not. However, because of the way that Kim Davis filed her petition, all she needs are 4 justices to agree on hearing the case. So we know Clarence Thomas, we know Alito, and we know that there is a chance that on a 6-3 majority, right, all they really need are 2 more. The liberal justices are not going to want to hear this case, but out of the 3 who are kind of thinking of not hearing it, I bet you at least 2 of them cave, okay? So once, let's say 4 of them do actually decide to hear the case. Once 4 agree to hear the case, they will need to make that decision by fall of 2025. Okay? So only a matter of months at this point will we know if the Supreme Court decides to hear a case about overturning same-sex marriage. Now, don't worry. As of today, right, if that law would be overturned right now, the Respect for Marriage Act that was passed during the Biden administration in 2022 would still protect recognizing same-sex marriages around the country. Now, what it does do is let's say you're married in Massachusetts and a state like Texas would not recognize same-sex marriage. Well, the Respect for Marriage Act would require at the federal level, Texas must recognize your marriage from Massachusetts. Even if it's across state lines, even if Texas doesn't want to issue, same-sex marriage, they still have to recognize yours from Massachusetts. However, the Respect for Marriage Act pretty much allows states to do states' rights. States' rights is really just another way to say discrimination because that's basically every single time people argue for states' rights, that's what it comes down to. So when you look at states' rights for same-sex marriage, there were, at the time when same-sex marriage was first declared law of the land, there were like 35 states with like bans on the books. So the fact that so many of these states have, of our 50 United States, wanted to ban same-sex marriage, shows me that the fight is not over, right? So if they overturned it today, the 35 bans or whatever it is, that number, that would go into effect immediately. So the states could opt out of recognizing your marriage in that particular state. We know states like Alabama, Mississippi, all the states in the South, right? They're not going to recognize your marriage at the state level, like at all. That's what they don't. They never wanted to, and it is discrimination because for those who don't know, same-sex marriage, right, allows same-sex couples to be entitled to over 1,000 different rules and regulations that are afforded to heterosexual couples, married couples, right? So it's not just a matter of like love is love. It's actually a matter of like, between how your taxes are filed, between who has custody of your children, between if you were to have a will, where does that estate go to, right? There are so many things that go into like rules and rights, and even something as, simple as hospital visitation rights. Like, Christian-owned hospitals could deny your same-sex partner to visit you on their deathbed because they have certain religious beliefs. Like, that's what that was happening before same-sex marriage became law of the land. Okay? So you can see why there is still very much a need for same-sex marriage and why our rights need to be protected at every level, at every turn, every state, everywhere you go. So with that said, should the 4 Supreme Court justices decide to hear the case, they will then need to actually hear oral arguments before the Supreme Court in the spring of 2026. All right? So whether that's April or May, we know it's going to be in the spring. Then, just like the Supreme Court has been doing for so many years now, they will then issue their final ruling in June of 2026. So even when same-sex marriage was first declared law of the land, that was June 26, 2015. I remember that date because I remember crying in my office when I read it on the news, because something like that, when you're growing up in a world where you didn't think that was possible, where people kept telling you no, when you felt like the world wasn't supportive of you because you felt like you didn't deserve those rights, right? That's the world I grew up in. So now being a little older and wiser, I realized just how fragile our rights really are and how fragile democracy can be. So because 2016 and 2024 presidential election both had so serious ramifications on the Supreme Court, now we see how a 6-3 conservative majority could really screw like huge swaths of the population and millions of people. So with all that said, we won't know until the fall. And if they do hear the case, we won't know until June 2026. If the case doesn't go well, right, and they wind up overturning same-sex marriage, that will be in June of 2026, just months before the midterm elections of November 2026. So this could be very interesting, where we know that electorally, right, Democrats are typically on track to regain the House. Every time there's a presidential election year, 2 years later we have the midterms. It usually the party in control swings the other way. We saw it with Obama. He won his historic election victory in 2008. Then the Republicans regained the majority, supermajority, in 2010, 2 years later. Same with President Trump when he won in 2016. Then we had a Democratic-controlled House with the largest share of women in Congress at that time, and one of the most diverse Congresses at that time in 2018. So same thing. President Biden had won in 2020, and then Republicans regained control of the House in 2022. So it is on track to see Democrats win in 2026. However, we know that Democrats are super unpopular, actually like the most unpopular that they've ever been since that metric has been recorded. So the fact that Democrats are not very popular, right before the midterm elections or the year before, is not good. Not good at all. So things might not go as the conventional wisdom wants us to think. So, if they overturn same sex marriage in June, that will rile up the liberal base so hardcore that could help Democrats take back the House. It could. Just the thought of getting more rights ripped away. We saw what happened with Roe v. Wade getting overturned, Dobbs' decision, the fact that this just impacts the left, liberals, everyone who, supports that side of the aisle, right? It shouldn't even be a left or right issue. It should really just be like, do you respect your fellow humans, basically. But at the end of the day, if it plays well for liberals and Democrats, right, and progressives, then we have a shot at taking back the House. However, we know that there's way more issues in play, right? For example, we know that Harris ran on abortion in 2024, thinking that was the winning issue because it polls so well with Democrats and the general public at large. However, because there's so many other issues at stake, right? Immigration and the economy and foreign policy, those three issues are what lost it for Harris. So we cannot take this one issue and assume that we got it in the bag. It'll help. It'll add fuel to the fire that Democrats need, but will it be enough to win? Personally, I don't think so. It's a social issue. Social issues are good, but I think what we are learning from the 2024 election and even Zohran Mamdani's victory, right? It's not that Republicans are so bad that they're losing and then in 2024 they won. It's really just a matter of affordability when wealth inequality is at some of the worst times it's been in this country. So the fact that we need to put food on the table, pay the bills, roof above your head, right? These are the issues that are going to matter to voters most, the bread and butter issues. So until we get that straightened out first, then will people be more comfortable, the anxiety coming down, because the economic anxiety coming down, because we're not really struggling to survive. Then we can focus on more social issues because everyone is taken care of. So will Democrats be able to pull that off for the midterm elections using issues like, if timeline of events I described happens, right? And then we also have to fight for same-sex marriage in the sense like, it's not that our rights would be taken away immediately, right? It's just that anyone who wants to get married after that point in time, they would have to go to a blue state or a state that recognizes or that has laws on the books at the state level to issue same-sex marriage licenses for them, for those couples. Because if it's like a red state, they're going to not be issuing those licenses. So people would have to be going to another state. At the end of the day, it's really going to come down to how these positions, people in these positions of power right now, they will have to play, I don't want to say three-dimensional chess, but they will have to play their cards well because it could either, if it's Republicans, it could really help them and gain control of the House. It will help, like not totally, but part of it. Whereas with Democrats, it could go the other way, fuel the fire, help with organizing, and if Democrats get their situation together, then we're looking at a victory in 2026 and giving some roadblock and buffer to the Trump administration so that Trump cannot take over New York City, cannot take over DC, and we will still have the right to marry. And at the end of the day, it will still allow LGBTQ plus individuals to have the dignity they deserve. There are so many LGBTQ plus individuals who may not get married, but because that is the law of the land right now, it affords us the dignity to be respected by our fellow Americans. So if they do overturn same-sex marriage, it's more than just losing rights. It is very much losing status, dignity, and respect. And the sad part is that there are so many homophobes out there chomping at the bit, or whether it's for their fear of the unknown. Homophobia is real, y'all. They just don't get it. They don't want to get it, and they resist so hard. So yeah, we need to keep fighting, living our queer, authentic selves. We just need to keep on celebrating who we are, being honest and open at every turn. because that is how we'll eventually, eradicate homophobia. Just the end of the day, we still have a lot of work to do, but we can make a difference. So, if you like what you heard and want to learn more, then feel free to subscribe to Not Suitable for Democracy on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. If you want to connect and stay tuned for more updates and follow along, then you can follow on Instagram at NSFD_pod. Last but not least, thank you so much for watching. And remember, democracy is not suitable without you.